A violent attack in Boulder, Colorado on campaigners for the release of hostages still held in Gaza. Deadly scenes at food distribution sites in Gaza. And we will be talking to one of Israel's foremost economists. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Jonathan and I don't do things by half measure, it seems. We meet very rarely, and when we do, we like an audience of hundreds of people to, witness that. We just don't, have coffee in London. We go bigger, I think.
We
Safe to
go
say.
bigger, and the countdown till our big London show, the first Unholy live show on Sunday. As you say, obviously a big deal to do a podcast live show, but what other podcasters don't also have is the novelty of being in the same country. I think I was working this out. I don't think you and I have been in the same room since November 2023. Is that
true.
right?
You were in Israel. Yep.
Because I was in Israel a couple of months ago, and it just so happened to be just when you weren't. We have not been lucky with timings, but now we are. We're going to be in the same place. And as you say, we need to have an audience as we have our reunion. So we're looking forward to that. We can't promote it. We can't push it because every seat in the venue has been sold. We are delighted that degree of enthusiasm for Unholy Live, but we will certainly bring a flavour or more of it to the podcast once it's up and done. We will, in our live show, like we always do with the podcast, talk first about the news. Our purpose in this podcast, as always, is Israel. It's the diaspora of the Jewish world outside Israel, and where the two meet. And that has now happened in violent form twice in recent weeks. First with the deadly shootings at the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., and then an incident in Boulder, Colorado, very, very shocking, in which a group who have regularly been marching, scheduling weekly peaceful marches, gatherings for the release of Israeli hostages still held in Gaza. The group is called Run for Their Lives. They were doing, as they've always done, one of these events in Boulder, Colorado, when a man opened fire, you'd have to say, with an improvised flamethrower. Appears to be petrol, gasoline, in one of those sort of backpacks that people use sometimes with weed killer, to fire flames at the group who were walking, many people very badly injured, some extremely severely, and the suspect still held. It just goes to a mood and anxiety that is felt all over the Jewish world, which is a fear, and one expert in the area did say this, that something different is happening here. This is a kind of terrorist movement, a new one, because the slogans that are being chanted and invoked are the slogans of the Free Palestine movement. The suspect apparently found with a whole lot of that kind of material with those slogans. In the case of the Washington, D.C. attack, he was heard by witnesses, the attacker there, saying Free Palestine, saying, "I did this for Gaza." So this is something different. This doesn't fit the pattern of sort of jihadist attacks. It's something new, and for Jewish communities around the world, extremely unnerving and disturbing.
It really is. And after what happened in D.C. at the AJC event, we discussed this on our last show. Look, I grew up in the United States. I remember when I was a kid, there was a security presence at every synagogue or Jewish center. We have normalized that. I don't know why we accept that as something normal. And it is important to say, I think, that way before October 7th, the worst attack against Jews in U.S. history was committed, Tree of Life, was committed by a right-wing extremist against immigration policy. It demands to say that anti-Semitism was always there and people are looking for an excuse to hate Jews. But it really is, I think, this added issue of what I don't know if you would agree with me, but what I would call this sort of 24-hour propaganda against what Israel is doing that is adding to this and aggravating this very much. As we say a lot, there are no incidents like that next to an Iranian center or a Russian center or a Chinese center in the U.S., not of them comparing Israel to any of those countries. But it is the Jews that's plight is exacerbated by this, by what is happening here in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if you have to go to the word propaganda. I think what you can talk about is the intensity of media coverage of Israel and the point that people often make, which is the differential, that there is more media coverage of Israel than those other examples you mentioned. And so when people see all that coverage, that definitely is having, clearly, a radicalizing effect. You mentioned Tree of Life, the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the assailant there invoking the slogans of the far right. The reason why terrorism experts are talking about this as a new formation is that the slogans invoked, I'm not even going into the psychology and the real motive. In some ways, I always think, and as a journalist, I always try not to pay too much attention to the gunmen, assailants, killers themselves. I'm not a big fan of naming them and so on. But the fact that the slogans of the left, broadly defined, were used this time means we're talking about something different and new. The other thing I was just going to say about it was I made this point in print last week. There is a desire to say, and particularly among on the left and pro-Palestinian activists, to imagine these categories are very distinct and very hermetically sealed. That there are people who are anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, they would say, and there are people who are anti-Semitic, and there are these two distinct moral categories. And the first category is completely legitimate, says one, says this view, and the second category, completely illegitimate and deplorable. And the two are in different worlds. I think after these two attacks, if you are somebody who's been saying that, perhaps to comfort yourself, you have to rethink. Because here's this man chanting, as I said, the slogans of Free Palestine and saying his own motive is to end Zionism and end Zionists, and that he's outraged by what's happening in Gaza. I'm sure the suspect in the DC case would say the same. And yet, who are they opening fire on? They're opening fire on Jews. And you're hitting, in the first case, the Capital Jewish Museum. So this idea that you can have in your head a murderous rage at Zionism and Zionists, and somehow that doesn't ever overlap with someone who is an anti-Semite, I think that's illusory and delusional. And I just think if you're somebody who's got those politics, you have to at least reckon with that. You have to say, if we're directing people all the time to be angry at Zionists and Zionism, their targets are not going to be some abstract intellectual category. They're going to be hitting at Jews. And so, if you, in this case, it was an Israel event. This group Run for Their Lives is about Israel and about Israeli hostages. But look, who are the people affected by this? A group of Jews, I think overwhelmingly, including a Holocaust survivor in Boulder, Colorado. These categories do not remain neatly sealed, even though some who engage in this area and this discourse would like them to be.
Yeah, and we'll add to that, just when you think of they were marching for the hostages. I mean, what could be more, innocent and a pure goal for someone? And when you think of what happened in DC when Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Milgram were killed. Again, this was a panel about how to help Gaza, right? How to have this interfaith conversation. I mean, it's another thing. It just adds to the sadness here. These are all people who are trying to make essentially the region better and the world better. And this is the price they pay for what we're discussing here. In the meantime, we were talking last week about what looked like, we looked like we were on the cusp of a breakthrough with the hostages in Gaza. As always, in the Middle East, sometimes, when you come close to the horizon, it just gets farther away. So it does seem like it's stuck now. Hamas said no to the Witkoff framework. It's now, working up its own plan. But the sides, particularly the United States, is still pretty, is pressuring both sides to somehow arrive at a deal. Again, not a whole deal, not the end of the war as soon as possible, but something that will at least manage to bring back a group of the hostages, about half of them alive, and have a ceasefire in Gaza for something like 60 days.
I wasn't holding my breath, I have to be honest, last week, I'm afraid. The idea that of one of the conditions from the Hamas side is that Israel agree to a permanent end to the war, and we just know that is something for political reasons. I think that is a move that Prime Minister Netanyahu just does not want to make.
No, in this case, it was clear that under the framework, Israel was willing to go to that, again, partial deal of 10 hostages and a ceasefire for 2 months. It was Hamas who said at this point, no, or at least we will bring a different deal to the table, which is the equivalent of no. But yes, as you said, there is a reluctance on the Israeli part to end the war, and Hamas is growing more desperate to end the war. That part is definitely true.
Yeah, that's the sticking point. It's 60 days Israel's fine with, and Hamas want it to be permanent. And so that's where we are. And, we've talked about hostages before. Get them all back and then, reconsider. That's my view. And apparently Hamas wanted American guarantees that the war would not start again. If it was me in that chair, pragmatically, I would do whatever it took to get the hostages home, to end this war. And if circumstances change, you reassess. I don't think Israel would be tying its hands particularly. I wanted, though, to talk about the event which has caused and attracted huge attention around the world. Two events, actually, which is at these food distribution sites, these scenes of violence, which in the second one on Tuesday morning, sources in Gaza say that at least 27 people were killed when Israeli soldiers opened fire. Now, there's a lot of confusion and argument about exactly what happened, but the Israeli military do concede that their forces did open fire near a few people who they say had strayed from the designated route to this food distribution site and didn't respond to warning shots. And, the IDF called them suspects, as if they feared that they were posing some kind of threat to soldiers, but Israel disputes the numbers. On the other side, 27 people killed, say, sources in Gaza, and that on a previous episode on Sunday, some 23 people killed there, according to the Palestine Red Crescent Society and other, NGOs. The point here that I was going to make is the whole system is the problem. You've got the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this new entity that's been set up, American-backed private contractors, in order to bypass the previous mechanism, which Israel said was sort of fatally corrupted, in which the UN distributed food. But it's just a disaster. That's why I think you saw the first boss of this foundation quit before it had even started. You have just 4 aid distribution points where the previous system had 400. You have these scenes that, even before we get to whether and how exactly soldiers open fire, this, from all reports, violent scramble, chaos, as people who are desperately hungry are scrambling for food. There's obviously not enough. The method is being criticised by the UN and others, because they say the mechanisms are just not there. They don't comply with humanitarian principles. It's too many people. They're overcrowded. And that they worry that, by having these distribution points mostly in southern Gaza, is this part of some plan to essentially displace the population of northern Gaza? Just take one step back and just think, food should not be a weapon. Let all the food in with all the risks that entails. The people of Gaza should not be starved. And if that means Hamas cream some off the top, I'm afraid that's a price worth paying.
So I would say a few things. One is, I would just, as a habit, if we're quoting sources in Gaza, I would just say it's Hamas sources in Gaza, just so we're clear on who we are quoting. Generally speaking, there is no more complicated humanitarian situation than the one in Gaza. I don't think there is an example that we can take from anywhere in the world. About the incidents that you mentioned, the IDF's version on this is a flat denial. We should also explain that what's happening here is that there's an American company that is distributing the food, and the IDF is actually standing pretty far away from all of these centers. It's a kilometer and more. In one case, the IDF is saying, look, there were people that started approaching us in a very threatening way. We fired in the air. That is what the IDF version of that incident is. I'm, not the spokesperson for the IDF, but I'm bringing that version because I think it's important to also say that is what they are saying. It is very clear that the food distribution from the very beginning has been the lifeline for Hamas. It's also clear that international organizations, however more experienced they are, and we must say more experienced than this American company in distributing food, also they were working, because that is the situation in Gaza, not because this was their choice, but they were working with Hamas operatives distributing the food because there was no other choice. That is also a problem in itself. If this plan had worked, if it is something that can work, again, you say there, and you're right, many more distribution centers are needed. If this could work, it is a better plan than giving this in the hands of Hamas. And you see the pressure that Hamas is under, and it's clearly under pressure to either sabotage the distribution, to lie about what is going on there, because they are so worried about the fact that this is not in their hands anymore. So there are two things going on here, and it's very clear they're going on. A, Israel's trying to portray this as a success. It's not really succeeding, if I understand between your lines. It's perhaps succeeding more internally than it is to the outside world. And Hamas is trying to sabotage this as much as it can because it is their lifeline. One thing we are definitely not arguing about is that the situation is desperate and needs to be solved as quickly as possible. We should mention that under the Witkoff framework, this whole apparatus goes back to the United Nations or any other humanitarian organization that is, as I said, more experienced in distributing this aid than the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why, Hamas absolutely should have accepted the Witkoff plan. I mean, if they wanted to feed the people of Gaza, they would have done it, as we've said many times, I hope. Mm-hmm. I've said I should have said on the podcast hundreds of times, Hamas don't care about their own people. We know that. You're not going to leave, you don't want to contract out, as it were, one's conscience to Hamas. They don't care about people being starved to death in Gaza. But Israeli policymakers should not be comfortable with food not getting into a civilian population, even if Hamas would be quite happy with the propaganda benefit of images of starving people being blamed on Israel. Israel itself should not want that. The idea that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so-called, could walk into Gaza and suddenly do this, that was why I was sceptical when we first talked about it. You just can't do that. You've got 2 million people who are on the brink of starvation. You need to rely on mechanisms, even when they are horribly flawed. And I think the fact that Jake Wood, who had accepted, in principle, he wasn't implacably opposed, the executive director, he'd accepted this operation on the idea of it, and then said it would just be impossible to implement its plan and adhere to humanitarian principles. The Boston Consulting Group, not exactly, a far left, hardcore, radical group, said it also stepped back from its involvement with the aid organization. And on Wednesday, the whole thing, the Humanitarian Foundation, paused all operations while they review it. This is obviously something that could not work. It was a fig leaf, I think, designed to reduce political international pressure, to say we're doing something. It was bound to fail. And given the cost and the stakes here, which are a population on the brink of starvation or starving, it should never have even been considered. This, as I say, should just be off limits and out of bounds. Politics inside the country has not stopped.
We are in the most shaky position this coalition has been in since October 7th, to be honest. What is happening, trying to zoom out as much as possible, Israel is in a war, and most of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox population, does not want to enlist. That is to make it a very simple case. What has to be written is a new law that needs to, for the large part, exempt this population from service. Of course, this is completely and utterly contentious during a war. There is really no law that can be written in this political environment that on the one hand, the ultra-Orthodox politicians will be happy with, and on the other hand, the Likud, which is the main party in the coalition, is getting a lot of heat for this, is going to be happy with. So we are in a stalemate. The ultra-Orthodox supported the budget. Remember, if they don't support the budget, then the coalition could have, the Knesset could have dissolved and we would have gone to elections. They did support the budget, but they demanded that until Shavuot, Netanyahu brings this law to the floor, to the Knesset plenum. Surprise, surprise, Netanyahu did say that he will, but he hasn't yet. And they are increasingly upset. More the United Torah Judaism, which is the Ashkenazi part of the ultra-Orthodox, and less Shas. But I would say that the one person to follow here, and you're going to hear a lot of threats from the United Torah Judaism area. The one person to look at is Aryeh Deri. He is the head of Shas. He is the head of the part of the ultra-Orthodox that are the Mizrahim, and he's a very important part of the coalition. Even if we arrive at a situation in which the United Torah Judaism do quit the coalition, Netanyahu still has the majority of 61, but it definitely means that everyone is smelling the smell of elections in the air. Now, this current Knesset session will last for another a little bit less than 7 weeks. Then we have a recess, and the Knesset reconvenes in October. That will be a year exactly before the actual elections, but I would put my money on they will be sooner than October 2026.
Interesting. Okay, well, we'll hold you to that. That's I hadn't heard that you being as certain on that before.
Okay, I'm putting Jonathan's money on the elections before 2026.
I mean, that's interesting because I was about to say this is one of those. Look, we know in the story the boy cries wolf, and eventually there is a wolf, right? Mm-hmm. Eventually, but in this case, this boy, not you, I'm talking about the Haredi parties, have cried wolf so many times. Where now it's finally coming to the showdown. I remember March the 31st was in my mind as the big day. The draft bill, it came and went. They still suck it up. And that's because but just you tell me if the underlying political calculation has changed, which is when all's said and done, they are better off in this government, and I literally mean better off, the money flowing to their religious institutions, than any other alternative that might come from elections. And therefore, because of that, they are never going to, even risk injuring, let alone killing, the golden goose that still gives to them. And so unless that political calculus changes, I don't see it myself, but tell me if the underlying picture has changed, and they now see an interest in toppling this government.
We need to take into consideration the fact that the actual law that existed expired. That means that, for instance, there are Haredim who will try to go abroad and they would be arrested for not enlisting. That means you have subsidies for the Haredim that are studying Torah for their children, and that is being canceled. So increasingly, they're feeling the pressure, and they're saying to themselves, wait a minute, if we go to elections, this whole situation is frozen. Let's start with that. And maybe we get a better deal in the next coalition. I agree with you that the underlying logic here doesn't really make sense, right? It kind of reminds you of, a small kid threatening to leave the house and then remembering that he doesn't know how to cross the street. I mean, as you say, they're still better off with all of the budgets that they're getting from this coalition. But these things have a dynamic of their own. And if you have the more extreme parts of the politicians and their rabbis, remember, the rabbis are telling them what to do in this case, and they can be more extreme. This can start a downward spiral that you don't know where it will end. And I'll remind you, there's another budget that needs to pass next March. No one in the political arena thinks that this government will survive that budget. So we are looking at a situation that is very, very precarious. And I think Netanyahu knows that as well. He's going to promise the world and postpone it as much as he can. But even, he has his limits.
Yeah. Well, no one thought this government was going to survive 600 days of war either. We thought after October 7th they surely couldn't survive. But Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the wiliest political operators in the world. The only person who might even come close is the one you mentioned, which is Aryeh Deri of Shas, who is a phenomenally effective politician who matches Netanyahu for longevity. I mean, he's been around for decades and decades, in and out of prison. I mean, he's survived even that in his career. So I absolutely agree with your advice that people should watch him very, very closely. That's a fascinating thought to see what happens. Many people will be quite glad, I think, of the prospect of elections if they come. It's probably best not to hold your breath, but we'll see. And Yonit has wagered my money, so we'll see what happens with that. Now, all through the conflict, we have inevitably talked about the immediate impact in terms of lives lost, in terms of the hostages and their captivity, the politics, the diplomacy. But a conflict like this has a huge effect on the economy of any country fighting a war, and definitely one like this. For 600 days with an army that is a citizen army, it has a huge impact. And we've, for a long time, wanted to speak to somebody about the economy, and we are doing that this week with someone extremely well placed to talk on that subject.
Nadine Baudot-Trajtenberg is an Israeli economist. She's the former deputy governor of the Bank of Israel. Today, she is the vice chair of the board of directors at the new digital bank Esh, and also teaches economy at the Reichman University. Nadine, thank you so much for being on Unholy.
My pleasure. I told you, always a pleasure to join two unholy Jews.
I feel that's what we are. I feel that fits us. I mean, we want to talk, the big sort of title of our conversation is the effect of the war on the Israeli economy. Honestly, where do we start? I mean, the budget that passed in March, largest ever, huge defense budget, the deficit, the credit ratings dropped, the inflation. I mean, what are you concerned about the most when you look at all this?
Two things I'd be concerned the most. One, perhaps ironically, are the missed opportunities. And two is indeed the increased pressure from the budget and the burden that we will continue to carry on ahead of us. And when I say budget, we know we have a large defense. It took Israel 40 years to get its defense expenditure to a relatively sustainable level. We doubled them in 2024. 2025 was going to start to see a reduction, but now with the new operations, not clear how much it will be reduced. And certainly we're expecting a high level. And, when I look, not necessarily my own, when I look at the various projection, is that we will not return to that sustainable level before 2032. That's a long time.
And can you just put some numbers on that? Just because in this country, for example, huge fuss about trying to get this budget share of defence spending from the budget up to 2.5%. Just for people who are listening to this, what are the figures?
So the budget, the defense expenditures as a percentage of GDP had come down to about 4.5% of GDP, which is fairly heavy indeed. You're trying to move it up to 2.5, and you find it difficult, right? It is difficult. There are tough decisions to make. So we had managed to bring it down to 4.5%. And as I said, it took 40 years to do that. We started with a, ridiculously high number. And in 2024, with the war that went on for the whole year and the economy, of course, that wasn't going anywhere, then that burden doubled to about 9% of GDP. And this year was expected to be at around 5.5% of GDP, but this was before the operation, and this was with expectations that, the war would basically end by Q2. We have 3 weeks to do that. Not clear at all that we're in that direction. So going back to the 4.5%, will take us a number of years, both because of the increased defense expenditure need, and it depends how fast we're going to be able to grow, of course, the economy. I mean, that's the thing. And when I say, and one of the reason I'm worried about that is because the burden of debt is also increasing, and I don't think that the interest rate environment is going to be going down. It probably is going to go down, as we know, in Europe. It may go down in the US, although inflation doesn't seem to be agreeing with that. But I don't expect the interest rate in Israel to go down very much. So that burden of debt is also expensive. And just to give you a sense, again, 2023, before the war, we were paying 2.6% of GDP in interest payment on a low level of debt. That amounts to just roughly something like, $13 billion a year of interest payment. And now we're seeing the debt increase with the interest rate also not coming down. So we're very likely to see an increase in that. And when you think about the fights over budget, I often find that, the government is being penny wise and pound foolish, in the sense that we argue about 100 million, shekels, which is about, 25, $30 million going here or going there. And we're completely disregarding the overall burden and how much we end up paying in interest payments, which is in the billions of dollars. And that worries me a lot, because that will weigh on every sector of the economy. So it's not just because of the war that tourism, of course, is not picking up, or that construction industry is being hurt. I mean, this is affecting everyone.
And when you look at the fact that Israel entered this crisis with relatively a sturdy economy, does that change it? Does it mean that the shocks of this are somewhat not as bad as they could have been? Or it doesn't matter at this point?
It makes a huge difference that we had so much cushions to absorb this huge shock. And in part, that's why perhaps people are surprised that we're still doing relatively well despite the size of the shock. But to build cushions takes a long time. And we had built cushions in that we had a relatively low debt burden, in that we have huge foreign exchange reserves at the central bank, because we're, in current account surplus year after year. And when I say year after year, it's year after year for the past 22 years or so. Prior to that, we have 40 years of deficits. So building cushions takes a long time. Using them can be very quick. Now, we haven't used all of the cushions. We're okay. Okay, so I'm not worried in the very short run, but they're being eroded again at a faster pace than any of the other shocks that we've ever had to absorb. And that is worrying.
Yonit at the top talked about all the different shocks that have come in, whether it's the credit rating dropping, inflation, obviously now this huge defense spend. But I want to take it to something very, very basic that people can visualize and understand, which is people and reservists mainly, who've been suddenly instructed to do 100 days, 200 days, 300 days, away from their families, obviously, but away from their jobs, not bringing in the income they would have brought in. And that is, a large number of people for a long period of time, this 600-day war. That surely, just on household disposable income, but family after family after family, has blown a huge hole through their own private economy, as it were, because the national economy is made up of millions of individual economies. How are Israeli families, Israeli, households managing with an earner, perhaps sometimes even the main earner, being just away from earning for hundreds and hundreds of days like that?
I mean, you're putting your finger on something which we're only now starting to talk about. And by the way, it's not just the reserve duty, the burden on the person themselves, and how do businesses cope with that, by the way. I have many young colleagues who've done 200, 300 days of reserve duty. So the extra burden on their coworkers is also being felt, but it certainly is their families. So it's the reserve duty people. It is also the injured and families of injured. Fallen soldiers' families are also feeling that. And of course, the displaced persons. That we still end this, so the displaced persons and their families. So all of these things, it's difficult to put a finger on it. But I would point, it's not necessarily the depletion of their personal finances, in part because reserve duties are being compensated. So the government has been able, if you want, to compensate to a certain extent. It's not able to compensate for the services that these people need. Okay, because they need social services, they need psychologists, they need therapists of various kind. This is a big, a very, so many tragedies to take care of. So there we don't have, because again, these are the type of things that you need to build a big cushion in order to absorb that. That we didn't build. So it's not just the families that are that are suffering, but also the people who are supporting them are also strained to the limit. It's true for the social workers. It's true that, the people in the medical field and therapists of various kind, and they are not being compensated either. What all of this does is that it certainly reduces our, I would say, which is very typical in Israel, our desire to do more than we were being asked for. The workforce in Israel is extraordinarily resilient. People as a society are extremely resilient. You always do more than you should be doing. You can do that for so long, and that is being eroded. So I see people around at work, they're not pulling as much as they pulled a year ago. And a year ago, we were at war. Okay. But you get tired of that. And the noise about relocation is becoming louder.
I'm just thinking of people who are not from Israel. Let's just explain one thing, because you mentioned compensation. When a reservist goes off to fight, does their employer continue paying their salary because they have to? Does the government pay a partial salary? Just one of you can just explain for non-Israelis how that factual thing works.
Yeah, the government basically continues to pay the salary. But, think about, and again, the Israeli society is also slightly different than a European one, which is everybody here has children. Okay. And it's everybody, even single sex couples have children. And they will have, it's not that we have 10 children, we have between 2 and 4 children. And these are typically at the age group where people are called on reserve duty. So I look at the people who work with me. These are 35 years old, 40 years old guys who have 3 kids, a wife who is also working, and they disappear for months at a time. The burden on their family is enormous. The strain on the family is enormous. And most of the time, the woman who stays behind not only has all of the kids to take care of, but she's also working. And so if you want, the quality of the workforce is being heard, that we measure, but what we don't measure is the burden and also the things that you just can't do anymore because you're on your own taking care of 3 kids.
Yeah. And also we have to say, if you have a small business, if you're not employed by a large company, then you have, and you're waiting for compensation, you can wait for a very long time. It's not going to come in.
And you can wait for a very long time.
Yeah. So that's also something that we should stress. You said the word relocation. Let's maybe focus on that, Nadine. And I'm just quoting from the Israeli Innovation Authority's recent report. It talks about the fact, it was just talking about the high-tech sector, but it said every month since the war, 800 employees in the high-tech sector left Israel. How concerned are you? It's not only in the high-tech sector, we should say, but it does happen. We hear those murmurs a lot in Israel these days.
I'm not sure what the level of relocation was before. Remember, when you look at numbers, it's a difference that is important, not necessarily the level. I mean, first of all, when we think of the high-tech sector, we should think of, this is the most highly paid individuals are in that sector. So they pull in their weight, certainly in the Israeli economy, because they will also be the big spenders. So they are indeed fueling the Israeli economy very well. It is also the sector where people on average tend to be young. So they are also hit by reserve duty, probably more than, or certainly they are being hurt. Pretty much, I look at the number of people on reserves around me again. I see there's many of them and for long periods. So, many of them might have want relocation in any case because they're more mobile than most other people. They have good opportunities elsewhere. And we didn't hear that much about it, I think, a year ago. Indeed, because these are people who are very, they care about the country. They might have been the people demonstrating the year before who were worried also about the judicial reform. So they care a lot. They're not the type of people who will refuse to go on reserve duty. But they've been doing it for so much more than they're typically asked for. The strain on their family. And they're with relative ease, the possibilities that they could move elsewhere. So I hear more of that, but particularly, for instance, for people who may work in companies that are global companies, and therefore they have within the same companies, they have opportunities. If you work for Google, you can work for Google in Zurich, or you can work for Google in New York. You don't need to work for Google here, and other companies as such. So that I hear from my friends in the high-tech sector, that there are people within those companies who are looking to continue to work for the same company, but relocating. And there might be some of the youngsters also. And it's not because these people want to leave Israel. There's so many of us who feel we need a break from all this. And, people would like to go on vacation abroad. There's no flights. And the price is incredibly high. So you can't get a break there. So you hear of people who they intend to come back. It's going to be, it may be a small break, but once you relocate, then it's not clear how fast you will come back.
There's so much attention paid to this is because Israel's unusual, isn't it? In that there's a body of people who are I think the people we're talking about, highly educated, often high earning, mobile, who really carry a kind of disproportionate share of the income earning burden of the country. I know the figure was once thrown around, there's about 400,000 people who between them are, earning the lion's share of the national GDP. And if you lose those people, the country loses a huge amount. It's not as if there is an endlessly deep well of people to draw from. It's those people that are actually earning the revenue that keeps giving Israel this very unusually high GDP and quality of life and so on.
It's true. But on the other hand, I would think that anybody who leaves is a big loss. It doesn't matter whether they're highly educated or not highly educated. Okay? Because even if I, lose someone who's just out of the army, did his 3 to 4 years. In fact, they're doing more than that. And they need a long break and they're going to be going away. And this might not have been a person who would have been highly educated afterwards. It's still an important part of the workforce. It certainly is an important part of Israeli society. So I don't like to put the emphasis on, these are all our best people. All of the people are our best people. You want them here. You want them to be able to produce, to live a full life, to have children. And
sure. I suppose I was thinking just in purely economic terms, you've got big chunks of the Israeli society that are economically inactive. And, famously people talk about getting more of the Arab Israelis into the workforce, more of ultra-Orthodox Jewish Israelis into the workforce. There are large numbers of people who don't do that much economically. We're not talking about their spiritual value to the well-being of the society. I'm talking about purely in terms of sort of GDP generation. There is a disproportionate.
But I think also often as GDP potential. Okay, so a young person who leaves is a GDP potential. I don't know how much the potential is going to be. Yes, you're right. By the way, even on average, we don't have a large part of society which is inactive. On average, the labor force participation in Israel is pretty much the same as an average OECD country.
That's really interesting because what we would think is that it's not the case, as when you mentioned, as Jonathan
So on average, it's not that we have a smaller, proportion or a larger proportion of the people who are inactive. It's, everyone has their population that is less active. It's just that in Israel, they're very, very easily identifiable. And we have perhaps a larger proportion of men who are inactive in the labor force, and they tend to be in the ultra-Orthodox sector. And in the Arab sector, by the way, it is the women who have a lower participation rate, although that has been growing quite fast during the past 20 years or so. And in fact, the labor force participation of Arab women in Israel is higher than that of Arab women in Arab countries anywhere.
That's all fascinating. I mean, one of the things that we talk about the situation, the fact that the war is prolonged, and you rightfully, I think, point out to the fact that Israel can deal with emergencies very well, but this emergency is really a prolonged emergency. The interesting thing, maybe it's a financial frustration here, but that there are chances and opportunities here that could change the financial situation, 180 degrees if, for example, there's an end to the war, a Saudi deal. What that means for the Israeli economy is something that, perhaps we should focus on.
Yeah, that was my second point, is there's sort of the lost opportunities, which is so frustrating. On the one hand, and that's the paradoxical situation we're in, to a certain extent, the defense situation, the security situation in Israel has never been better. We're certainly in much better situation than we were on October 6, 2023, with Hezbollah being not dismantled, but greatly weakened. Certainly Hamas being dramatically weakened. I mean, Syria, which has to reconstruct itself. Let's put it this way. So we're in probably the most comfortable security situation we have been in, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we're on the cusp of reaching a broad regional agreement that would include Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is the big economy in the neighborhood, like by a long shot. We're at the moment very happy that we have economic relations and, of course, all relations with the Emirates. And by the way, we feel this a lot for people who travel in and out of Israel. Air Dubai is basically the only airline that hasn't canceled on us. So many of us wanting to go abroad often end up flying through Dubai. So, this little agreement of the Abraham Accord, we feel it a lot. Now, an agreement with Saudi Arabia is an order of magnitude different than larger than the one with the Emirates. And, I always say that, and I was brought up in Canada, as you know, and Canada has had the huge advantage of living next to the US. And I say the huge advantage from an economic point of view, you get a huge market next to you, which Israel never had. And suddenly we have the possibility of having a large economy to be able to trade with. I mean, this is a game changer for Israel, a real game changer. And we're letting this pass? Or, it's like, again, being penny wise and pound foolish.
So you talked about that opportunities that are lost. I want to talk about threats that are on the horizon, because and you very skillfully laid out how Israel's defense posture is now stronger because Iran is weak and Syria is going through this transition and so on. On the other hand, its diplomatic position has never been worse in some ways. The threat of sanctions. You look at, for example, that triple intervention by Mark Carney of Canada, your former country, Keir Starmer of Britain, Emmanuel Macron of France, saying if there aren't changes, humanitarian aid, a ceasefire and so on, they will look at their own trade arrangements with Israel and other measures, including potentially the threat of sanctions. The European Union looking again at its trade association agreement. Just explain to us, first of all, how important economically, pounds, shillings and pence, dollars and cents, that is to the Israeli economy, those relationships with the Europeans, with Canada and so on. So how much is at stake, and how you assess the likelihood of there being some kind of economic isolation to match what is looking increasingly like diplomatic isolation?
So if we look at Israeli exports, of course, imports are just as important, by the way. It's about a third of GDP, which is a large amount. And if you look at where Israeli exports go, they're about a third, a third, a third. So a third to North America, a third to Europe, and a third to the rest of the world, mostly Asia, of course. Okay? So a third of a third is about 10% of GDP, right? So it's $50 billion or so. It's a lot of money. I mean, it's a huge difference. That's on the export side. On the import side, it's more tilted Europe. We import more than Europe than we do from North America. So about 45% of our imports are from Europe. So again, and it's about the same size. But, you talk about sanctions, even before sanctions. And these are things that I think we're starting to feel now already, even before sanctions. As you said, it's not just the diplomatic situation of Israel in general in the world that has deteriorated. It is the relationship between Israeli people and everybody else around the world to a dramatic extent. Okay? And that is already being felt. My thesis advisor was Larry Summers. And Larry was quoted during the financial crisis as saying that the big difference when you have a crisis, it's not that risky assets become riskier. It is that what you thought were safe assets are suddenly risky. Well, I would use the same metaphor, if you want, with respect to relationship. It is not that our, far away, perhaps friends have become less friendly, but it is what we thought as safe friends are suddenly becoming unsafe. And that is a crisis. So we already are in a crisis. And even without sanctions, without official boycotts, people are much more reluctant to have trade relationship with Israeli firms. So unless you're buying something which you absolutely need, then you may not. And I'll give you an example. My sister was shopping in a supermarket in Canada, and there was a woman who she thought was a friend said, "Oh, did you notice they have tangerines from Israel? I will complain to the supermarket manager." He doesn't need sanctions. He doesn't need anything. He needs a comments from a couple of clients, and he will, get his tangerines from Morocco.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this is already happening, and this will take a long time to rebuild. And I don't think, and when I say a long time, I mean a very long time
Do
to
you mean
rebuild.
years, decades, when you say a long time?
I would say decades to rebuild, unless there's a regional agreement and we enter into a new era in the Middle East and we're part of that. Then people will switch their minds. But without something dramatic like that, it will take decades to take.
I want you to notice, Nadine, that I was the optimist with the Saudi deal and Jonathan was the pessimist with the sanction. I just want us to make note of that. But I do want to ask you, and this, it's something that you and I talk about, I think, often when we meet and talk. And that is, I mean, you're one of the first women Rhodes scholars, a Ph.D. in economics from Harvard. As you said, your thesis advisor was Larry Summers. I wonder if now we're in 2025, if economy is still very much a man's club, particularly in Israel. I mean, we should also mention your husband, a very prominent economist in this country, Manuel Trajtenberg. Is it still very much a man's business here? Perhaps maybe not only here?
Yes, it is. It is. I mean, it's interesting that economics has remained with the stronghold of men. And let's put it this way, the improvement in terms of seeing more women economists as a group, the improvement has been far less than in physics or engineering. I mean, they started from a very low point. That's true. But you've seen more improvement there than you have in the world in economics, even more so in the world of, economics, policy, and even more so in monetary economics, by the way. And yes, it is still a stronghold. Not clear why. Very competitive, very blind to discrimination in general. Economists find all sorts of ways to explain discrimination. And so it's often not a comfortable club to be part of. Let's put it this way.
Well, we're glad you joined our unholy club today. We are very, very grateful for those insights. Thanks so much for joining us on Unholy.
Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. And keep it up.
Thanks so
Both
much.
the unholiness and the podcast.
Nadine is brilliant, and it's always so interesting to listen to her analyzing the Israeli economy at this particular moment, whereas I think it was pretty clear from conversation, there are grave threats in this kind of precarious position we are in, but also opportunities. And I think it was very interesting. There's a line that she said there about how there are many tragedies to treat in the country, which I think is very apt to where we are. But I think that was a fascinating conversation.
It really was, and also making human economics, which so often is it seems, the dismal science. It can seem as if it's just numbers. And she reminded us many times, actually, that this is a human phenomenon and there's a human cost. Look, I think a couple of sobering things there. That her point that whether Macron and Starmer and Makani impose sanctions or not, it's already happening. And her story about the tangerines in the supermarket. Yeah. Many people listening to this will have equivalents of that. They'll know of stores, shops where they've had conversations like that. And this sort of soft boycotting, quiet boycotting is already happening. The drop-off of tourism would be an example of that. And her warning that it will take years or decades to come back unless there is some big breakthrough. And, the peace camp in Israel is so sort of marginal and historic, really, now. People talk about it as a kind of anachronism and a relic. And yet there's a huge economic argument to be made for what life could be like if there was some regional understanding. And I think she spelt that out very, very well. Last thing, though, I have to say, that figure, 4.5%, as being the low figure. Huge arguments around the rest of the world about getting defence spending up to 2% or to up to 2.5. After we'd finished our conversation, Nadine mentioned that back in the day, in the mid-70s, it was 35% of Israel's GDP went on defence. Yeah. I mean, talk about a peace dividend. To go down from that to 4.5, but 4.5 is still so high compared to most other countries. And of course, now in the last 20 months or so, it's been much higher than that. So I think it is time for our weekly ritual of handing out awards, Yonit.
So we shall give this, not for the first time and perhaps not for the last time, to Donald Trump, who rescinded his nomination of the head of NASA, Jared Isaacman, a Jewish entrepreneur, we should say. He's very close to Elon Musk. So that may give you the beginning of a hint of why Trump rescinded his decision to withdrew his nomination of him as the head of NASA. He nominated him in December and then rescinded it because he wrote on his Truth Social, it was because of a thorough review of prior associations. It was reported that Trump privately told his allies that he was distressed. He had denoted to Democrats in the past. And as I mentioned, I'm not sure that his ties to Elon Musk in this week of all weeks helped him very much in his CV as being the head of NASA.
Yeah.
But it just makes you think, if he was fit for the job, then he's fit for the job. It doesn't matter who his friends were or who he donated to. I mean, but I guess we're not living in that kind of world anymore.
So we still have to wait, don't we, for the Jewish space laser that was promised to us by Marjorie Taylor Greene, because apparently we have space lasers that control the weather, and we got so close, nearly having the head of NASA.
Nearly had a Jewish head of NASA.
Who could have wielded those lasers? We'll have to go back to the drawing board on that. Shall I do our Mensch Award?
Yes, it's only fit, sir.
So I think not everyone appreciates that the third largest Jewish community in the world after Israel and the United States is France. The Jews of France, a long and storied community, or a community with a long history. And perhaps the most famous episode in French Jewish history was back in the news this week, because on Monday, a group of French politicians took the first step towards righting a wrong and to remedy the notorious injustice, which was the case of Alfred Dreyfus, the French Jewish army captain who was famously accused of treason, wholly falsely accused. Somebody else had done the crime that was laid at Dreyfus's door. He was condemned, he was humiliated, stripped of his rank and sent to exile in Devil's Island. It's a famous case from the end of the 19th century that absolutely split French Jewry and persuaded at least one person that Jews should no longer and could no longer assimilate, but needed a state and home of their own. Cue Theodor Herzl. So, and Zionism. But Alfred Dreyfus just remains this sort of totemic figure. So this week, on Monday, French politicians took this step to promote Alfred Dreyfus, who was a captain in the army, to the rank that he should have had, to brigadier general. It would be a very, obviously symbolic act. The prime mover behind this is the former prime minister of France, Gabriel Attal, whose own father was Jewish, a man who has the distinction of being 36 years old and yet a former prime minister under Emmanuel Macron. But I think should we give Gabriel Attal the Mensch Award for seeking to restore to Alfred Dreyfus that promotion that should have been his to brigadier general. Attal said it would be constitute an act of reparation, a recognition of his merits and a tribute to his commitment to the Republic. So we would like to see that happen, I think, and good anyway, just to raise awareness of that extraordinarily important episode in French Jewish history.
Yes, and under the title, Better Extremely Late Than Never, perhaps.
Yes.
But I mean, isn't history a funny thing? Because what a terrible affair that whole thing is. But if it wasn't for a journalist in France at the time, Theodor Herzl, and his shock at this story and his understanding really that without a Jewish homeland, this will continue to happen. I wouldn't be sitting here. We'd perhaps do our podcast as we have this harbor dream about two Nords on the fjords, perhaps, but we wouldn't have been doing this podcast. And Zionism, at least in this form, wouldn't have existed. So it's just in the way of what one event can do to world history.
Right.
But definitely, I think it's the Mensch Award is important and completely agreed by all of the Unholy Board this week.
Yeah, there's unanimity on our committee.
Exactly. So we will say our thank yous to Michal Porat, and we will meet next week.
Well, we'll actually meet in just a day or two, Yonit. We're so not used to it. So we will see each other very soon, and we will be with you, our beloved listeners, next week. See you then.